Imagine a life where your entire worth, your very survival, depended on a single, unpredictable outcome. What if your personal happiness, your family's legacy, and the stability of an entire empire rested solely on whether you bore a son? In 790 AD for queens across Europe, this was not a hypothetical thought experiment, it was their terrifying reality. Number 12. The queen's own status and power. The life of a queen in 790 AD was one of immense privilege, adorned with silks and jewels, waited upon by a retinue of servants, and residing within the gilded halls of power. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay a relentless current of anxiety, a constant, unspoken dread that permeated every aspect of her existence. For many queens, particularly those recently elevated to their position, or those from less powerful noble houses, their very standing within the court, their influence over the king, and even their physical security were inextricably linked to their ability to produce. Queen's position was precarious. Her status, despite her royal title, was often contingent upon her utility to the dynasty. If she bore a son, especially a healthy, robust boy, her stock soared. She became the venerated mother of the future king, securing her place at the pinnacle of society, solidifying her family's alliance with the crown, and guaranteeing her influence at least for a time. She would be seen as blessed, fertile, and fulfilling her divine and earthly duty. Her word might carry more weight with the king, her requests be more readily granted, and her personal comfort ensured she had proven her worth in the most undeniable way possible. However, if she failed to conceive, or worse, bore only daughters, her position would begin to erode, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The whispers would start in the dark corners of the castle, echoing through the courtyards and the noble assemblies. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Was she truly worthy of the king's bed and the royal name? Her family, who had likely invested significantly in her marriage to the monarch, would grow increasingly nervous, their aspirations for increased power and prestige through the royal union beginning to crumble. This pressure was not just psychological, it was a very real threat to her position. King, desperate for a son, might begin to entertain thoughts of annulment, a relatively common practice in this era, often justified by claims of consanguinity or a lack of consummation, but often serving as a convenient legal means to dispose of an infertile or daughter-producing queen. Such an annulment would not only strip the queen of her title and status, but would also send her back to her family in disgrace, or worse, condemn her to a convent, effectively erasing her from the political landscape. Her children, if they were daughters, might lose their high status, becoming mere bargaining chips in future alliances, or even be deemed illegitimate if the king's marriage was annulled. Consider Theodelinda, a Lombard queen from a slightly earlier period, whose story, though not exactly 790 AD, illustrates the dynastic pressure. While she produced a daughter, her ability to maintain power was exceptional and often tied to her personal political acumen and alliances, rather than solely her offspring. For many, though especially those less politically shrewd or well-connected, a barren womb or a lack of sons spelled disaster. The queen's family, initially elated by the royal match, would become powerful proponents of her fertility, urging her to seek out remedies, make pilgrimages, and engage in elaborate rituals, all designed to ensure the birth of a male heir. They had a vested interest in her success, as their own standing in the realm often rose or fell with hers. Queen who gave birth to a son cemented her family's connection to the ruling dynasty, creating a powerful nexus of kinship that could endure for generations. This connection brought land, titles, influence, and protection. Without it, their power base was significantly weakened, leaving them vulnerable to rivals. Queen's personal retinue, her ladies-in-waiting, and her household staff also felt the reverberations of her fertility. Their fortunes, their very livelihoods, were tied to the queen's stability. If she was cast aside, they too would often be dismissed, leaving them adrift. This created a subtle, yet pervasive, atmosphere of expectation and even fear within the queen's own chambers. Every ailment, every missed monthly cycle, every sign of pregnancy or its absence would be scrutinized, discussed, and prayed over. The queen would feel the weight of these hopes and anxieties from those closest to her, adding another layer to the immense pressure she already carried. Her personal comfort, her ability to control her own household, and her voice in court matters were all amplified by the presence of a son. A king might be more inclined to listen to the advice of the mother of his heir, trusting her judgment more, as she had proven her worth in the most fundamental way. Her secure position allowed her to advocate for her family, for her chosen charities, or for specific policies, transforming her from a mere consort into a significant political actor in her own right. Conversely, a queen who failed to produce a son might find her influence waning, her advice dismissed, and her household budgets tightened. She might even be subtly, or not so subtly, undermined by rivals at court, who saw an opportunity to advance their own daughters or nieces into the king's bed. Prospect of a king taking a mistress, or even a second unofficial wife, though bigamy was forbidden by the church. Historical precedent shows rulers sometimes bent these rules for the sake of an heir, or simply disregarded the church's strictures and practice. Loomed large. Such a situation would further diminish the queen's standing, reducing her to little more than a ceremonial figurehead, while another woman provided the longed-for son. This was a direct threat to her personal dignity and her remaining power. Scholars like Dr. Philippa Gregory, though often writing about later periods, articulates the precariousness of a queen's position without a male heir, emphasizing that her primary role was often seen as procreation. In 790, this sentiment was even more deeply ingrained, a basic expectation from the moment a royal marriage was consecrated. Her very existence as queen was predicated on this singular paramount duty. Number 11. Superstition and omens. In 790, the world was a tapestry woven with threads of faith, folklore, and deeply ingrained superstition. For a queen struggling to conceive a male heir, or one who had only produced daughters, the pressure was not merely political or social. It was profoundly spiritual and often terrifyingly superstitious. The failure to bear a son was not simply seen as a medical or biological issue. It was frequently interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a curse, or an ill omen for the entire kingdom. People believed that God or even malevolent spirits had a direct hand in human affairs, especially in something as crucial as the continuation of a royal line. If a queen did not conceive a son, whispers would begin to circulate throughout the realm. Was she secretly a witch? Had she offended God in some way? Was the king's marriage unblessed? These questions, though often unfounded, could gain traction and create a climate of fear and suspicion around the queen. The absence of a male heir could be seen as an omen of impending disaster for the kingdom itself. A barren queen might be viewed as a living prophecy of the dynasty's end, or even worse, a harbinger of famine, plague, or military defeat. If crops failed, or if an enemy army encroached upon the borders, some might quickly point to the queen's empty nursery as the cause, believing that her lack of a son had angered the heavens or broken the natural order. This deeply rooted belief system placed an enormous, unseen burden on the queen. She was not just a woman trying to conceive. She was carrying the spiritual weight of the entire realm. She might be forced to undergo various rituals, not just for fertility, but also to prove her piety and ward off perceived evil influences. Pilgrimages to holy sites known for their miraculous cures, lengthy fasting, copious prayers, and donations to monasteries were common practices undertaken by queens, desperate to demonstrate their devotion and invoke divine favor. These were not optional spiritual exercises. They were expected public displays of penance and plea, a desperate attempt to appease whatever forces were deemed to be withholding a son. Consider the prevailing beliefs surrounding birth defects or miscarriages. If a queen conceived but then miscarried or gave birth to a child with an obvious physical deformity, it could be interpreted as an even stronger sign of divine wrath or demonic interference. Such unfortunate events would intensify the pressure on the queen, leading to even more fervent prayers, more public displays of piety, and even greater scrutiny of her personal life and past sins, real or imagined. Court, the nobility, and the common people alike would scrutinize her every action, seeking explanations for the lack of a male heir in the supernatural realm. There were also ancient pre-Christian beliefs that lingered even within Christianized Europe. Certain pagan fertility rites, often Christianized or subsumed into local folklore, might still be secretly practiced or suggested to queens. These could involve specific herbs, charms, or visits to ancient sacred places, all in the desperate hope of invoking a male birth. While the church frowned upon such practices, the sheer desperation for an heir often overrode strict religious dogma in the privacy of personal chambers. The concept of a cursed bloodline could also arise if a dynasty struggled repeatedly to produce male heirs. If a queen married into a line that had a history of only producing daughters, or if previous queens had struggled with fertility, the current queen might be seen as merely continuing a pattern, a victim of an inherited curse. This would add an immense psychological burden, as she would be battling not just her own biological reality, but also the weight of ancestral misfortune in the eyes of the populace. Scholars of early medieval belief systems, such as Dr. Alistair MacGregor in his work on popular religion, describe how deeply ingrained these superstitions were, affecting everything from daily life to royal succession. Raised in a world where omens were real and divine intervention was commonplace, she might genuinely fear that her inability to conceive a son was a sign of her own unworthiness, or a punishment for some unknown transgression. This personal terror would compound the external pressures, making her desperate to fulfill her perceived spiritual duty. Constant need to appear pious, virtuous, and blessed was therefore paramount. Any perceived moral failing on the part of the queen could be immediately linked to her fertility struggles, further cementing the superstitious narrative. She had to be beyond reproach, a paragon of virtue, lest her lack of a son be attributed to her own sin. The whispers and rumors were not just gossip. They were a societal judgment, fueled by deep-seated beliefs in the supernatural that could have devastating consequences for a queen's reputation and her ultimate fate. Collective anxiety of the kingdom about the continuation of the dynasty often manifested as a heightened sensitivity to omens, dreams, and any perceived sign from the divine, all of which would then be interpreted through the lens of the queen's fertility. This made her body, her womb, and her ability to conceive a male heir a subject of not just political interest, but also profound spiritual concern and widespread superstitious dread. Number 10. Economic stability. The link between a queen producing a male heir and the economic stability of the kingdom might not seem immediately obvious, but in 790 ad Tade it was a fundamental truth that shaped every aspect of royal life. Clear, undisputed male heir was the bedrock upon which the entire economic structure of a medieval realm rested. Without one, the future was uncertain, and uncertainty was a direct threat to the kingdom's wealth and prosperity. Imagine a merchant in Aachen or Paris, or a farmer tilling his fields in the heartland of the Carolingian Empire. Their ability to conduct trade, to harvest their crops, and to plan for the future depended entirely on the continued stability of the ruling power. If there was no male heir, or if the succession was disputed, the risk of civil war loomed large. Civil war meant chaos. Roads would become unsafe for merchants, trade routes would be disrupted, markets would shrink, and production would halt as men were conscripted into armies or fled their lands. Farmers would face the threat of their fields being trampled by warring factions, their harvests seized, and their families endangered. This would lead to widespread poverty, famine, and a dramatic decrease in the kingdom's overall wealth. The royal treasury itself was directly impacted by this uncertainty. Taxes, levies, and tributes were collected most efficiently when the central authority was strong and undisputed. If the future of the crown was uncertain, local lords might become less inclined to pay their dues, hoarding resources for their own potential bids for power, or simply waiting to see who emerged victorious. This would starve the royal coffers, making it impossible for the king to maintain his army, pay his officials, or undertake large-scale infrastructure projects that benefited the economy, such as building bridges or improving roads. A strong, stable succession, guaranteed by a male heir, allowed for long-term planning. King could invest in new lands, encourage specialized crafts, regulate markets, and enter into stable trade agreements with other rulers. Knowing that his policies would likely continue under his son, this predictability fostered economic growth and confidence. Merchants would be more willing to invest in long voyages, knowing that their goods would be protected and that a stable market awaited them. Peasants would be more inclined to work their land diligently, knowing that their taxes would be predictable and that their livelihoods would not be arbitrarily seized by warring factions. The queen's body, therefore, became a symbol of this economic security. Her fertility, specifically her ability to produce a son, was not just about the royal bloodline. It was about the very lifeblood of the economy. If she failed to produce a son and a succession crisis emerged, the economic fallout could be catastrophic. Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne in 790 AD, was still consolidating its vast territories and building a cohesive economic system. Continued prosperity relied heavily on the stability of its leadership. A strong, clear male heir meant continuity, meaning continued security for trade routes, predictable tax collection, and the ongoing enforcement of laws that protected economic activity. Without this, the entire system could unravel. Historian Chris Wickham, in his extensive works on the early medieval economy, often details how political stability was the primary driver of economic prosperity or decline. In 790, a monarch's personal fertility was directly linked to this political stability. Furthermore, a kingdom's ability to project power and secure resources externally was also tied to its internal stability. Kingdom, embroiled in a succession crisis due to a lack of a male heir, would be seen as weak and vulnerable by its neighbors. This could lead to a decrease in favorable trade agreements, a rise in opportunistic raids from external forces, or even outright attempts at annexation, all of which would severely damage the kingdom's economic health. Conversely, a king with a strong, legitimate male heir was in a much stronger bargaining position on the international stage. He could negotiate treaties from a position of strength, knowing that his realm was secure. The implications of this were immense, extending far beyond the palace walls and into every village and marketplace. Queen, by virtue of her reproductive capacity, held the key to unlocking this broader economic future. Her success in bearing a son was not just a personal triumph. It was a national economic imperative, a guarantee of future stability and wealth for the entire realm. Her inability to do so was not merely a personal disappointment, it was a direct threat to the financial well-being and security of all the people within the kingdom's borders. Number 9. Influence of the nobility and court. The king might be the supreme ruler in 790. Odd, but his power was never absolute. He ruled with the council, and often the conditional loyalty of his powerful nobility and the intricate network of the court. These influential lords, counts, dukes, and bishops, along with their families and vast retinues, were constantly vying for power, prestige, and land. For them, a clear and legitimate male heir was not just a matter of royal convenience. It was a fundamental necessity for their own continued existence and advancement. Queen's inability to produce a son directly threatened the stability that the nobility craved, and they would exert immense unspoken pressure on her to fulfill this most critical duty. Each noble family had invested heavily in the current political order. They had sworn oaths of fealty, paid homage, and often contributed their own men and resources to the king's armies. In return, they expected land, titles, judicial authority, and the security of knowing that their own positions were stable under a continuous legitimate line of succession. If there was no male heir, the prospect of a succession crisis loomed large. This meant civil war, the potential for rival claimants to the throne, and the terrifying possibility that their own allegiances would be tested, or worse, that their lands and titles might be stripped away by a new victorious faction. The nobility often had their own ambitions for their daughters and sons, hoping to marry them into powerful families or secure positions at court. A stable royal line, particularly one with multiple male heirs, offered more opportunities for such strategic marriages and appointments. A queen who provided a male heir therefore directly contributed to the security and continued prosperity of the noble class. They would view her as a valuable asset, a source of stability, and would likely offer her their support and loyalty. Their wives and daughters would also exert pressure subtly or overtly on the queen. Through their interactions at court, the court was a hotbed of intrigue and social hierarchy. The wives of powerful nobles would constantly assess the queen's situation, for her success or failure directly impacted their own family's fortunes. Conversely, a queen who failed to produce a son would find herself increasingly isolated, a target of their unspoken anxieties. The nobles would begin to consider alternatives, perhaps even suggesting a new bride for the king, or openly discussing the problem of the succession in hushed tones behind her back. Some ambitious noble families might even discreetly put forward their own female relatives as potential new wives for the king, hoping to elevate their own family's status by providing the much-needed male heir. This created an atmosphere of subtle hostility and judgment around the queen. She would feel the weight of their expectations and their disappointment, knowing that her failure directly impacted their security and future. Chroniclers of the Carolingian era, such as those responsible for the Annales Regni Francorum, frequently allude to the influence of the magnates in royal affairs, particularly succession. King often relied on their counsel and support, making their collective anxiety about the lack of an heir a potent force. The church, too largely drawn from the nobility, would add its voice to this pressure. Bishops and abbots, often serving as royal advisors, understood the importance of a clear succession for the stability of the kingdom and the preservation of the church's own property and influence. They would subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, encourage the king to ensure a male heir, even if it meant taking drastic measures concerning the queen. Queen was often the subject of intense scrutiny from these powerful figures. Every ritual, every prayer, every apparent attempt to secure a male heir would be watched. She knew that her failure meant not just personal disappointment, but also the collective apprehension of the most powerful people in the kingdom, people whose influence with the king was considerable. Her legitimacy as queen was tied to her ability to produce the next generation of rulers, and the nobility were the primary stakeholders in this grand dynastic gamble. Their unspoken agreement to support the king's rule was contingent on the clear continuation of his lineage through a male heir. Number 8. The personal ambition of the king. While the previous pressures on a queen were external, stemming from society, politics, and even superstition, perhaps none was as immediate and deeply felt as the personal ambition and desires of the king himself. In 790, at a king's legacy, his very purpose was inextricably tied to the continuation of his bloodline through a male heir. For a monarch like Charlemagne, who was actively building and expanding an empire, the idea of his life's work dissolving into chaos after his death due to a lack of a legitimate son was a horrifying prospect. His ambition was not just about ruling in his lifetime. It was about ensuring his name, his family, and his achievements endured for centuries. Every king desired to found a lasting dynasty. This was the ultimate measure of his success, a testament to his strength, his divine favor, and his leadership. King without a son was a king whose line was destined to end, whose conquests might unravel, and whose name might fade from history. This personal ambition was a powerful, silent driver of the pressure on his queen. Imagine the king's anxious anticipation with each pregnancy. His hopes, his prayers, his entire future were invested in the child within his queen's womb. If it was a daughter, there would be a polite welcome, perhaps even genuine affection, but beneath it, an undeniable pang of disappointment. If it was a son, there would be immense joy, public celebrations, and a feeling of profound relief. This constant cycle of hope and potential disappointment played out in the private chambers of the king, but its psychological weight pressed heavily on the queen. She knew that her husband's deepest desire was a son, and her inability to provide one would be a constant, painful reminder of her perceived failure in his eyes. The king also needed a son to train as his successor. In 790, leadership was often military, and kings personally led their armies. A son would be taught from a young age how to fight, how to govern, how to command respect, and how to forge alliances. This was not something that could be passed on to a daughter in the same way. Given the societal norms and expectations of the time, the king's ambition was to ensure a smooth transition of power, a seamless handover of his crown and his legacy to a capable, legitimate male heir. Furthermore, a king's personal reputation was often tied to his virility and his ability to sire many children, particularly sons. In a patriarchal society, this was a clear sign of his strength and his divine favor. A king who struggled to produce sons might face whispers about his own capabilities, his manhood, or even his relationship with God. This would be a deeply humiliating and threatening prospect for any monarch, adding another layer of personal pressure to ensure his queen bore a son. He would be constantly comparing himself to other rulers, to his own ancestors, to his own ideals of what a king should be. Historical accounts, even those from this period, often praise kings for their numerous progeny, especially male. Charlemagne himself had many children, both legitimate and illegitimate, a testament to this societal expectation of a king's prolific virility. While he had several legitimate sons who survived to adulthood, the societal pressure for heirs would still have been paramount for all his wives. The king's personal relationships with his own family, his brothers and his male relatives would also amplify this pressure. They might have their own ambitions for the throne, and the absence of a direct male heir from the king would open the door for their claims, leading to potential rivalry and conflict. The king's ambition to secure his own branch of the dynasty would be fiercely personal. He would want to prevent anyone else from taking what he had built, from claiming his name and his legacy. Therefore, his queen was the primary means by which he could achieve this deeply personal and dynastic ambition. Her fertility was his hope, her womb the vessel for his enduring legacy. Her failure was his personal catastrophe, a direct blow to his deepest desires and the very foundation of his reign. This intimate yet immense burden was a constant, unspoken expectation that defined the queen's existence in the king's private life. Number 7. Fear of foreign invasion or annexation. In 790 AD, the map of Europe was a shifting mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and emergent empires, constantly challenged by internal rebellions and external threats. For any ruler, and especially for a queen, whose very purpose was to secure the dynasty, the fear of foreign invasion or outright annexation loomed large, and this fear was directly exacerbated by the absence of a clear male heir. Kingdom without a legitimate, undisputed male successor was seen as inherently weak, vulnerable, and ripe for the picking by ambitious neighbors. Imagine the ruler of an adjacent territory looking across his border. If he learned that the kingdom next door was facing a succession crisis because the queen had failed to produce a son, it would be an irresistible opportunity. Why fight a strong, united kingdom when you could simply wait for it to tear itself apart from within? The lack of a male heir immediately signaled instability. Other rulers would know that without a clear successor, the death of the current king could plunge the realm into civil war, as various factions, often led by ambitious relatives, vied for the throne. Such internal conflict would drain resources, weaken defenses, and leave the kingdom exposed. Clever or aggressive foreign power might then seize the moment, invading with the justification of restoring order, protecting a distant claim, or simply taking advantage of the chaos to expand their own territory. This was a common tactic in medieval politics. For the queen, therefore, the pressure to produce a son was not just about the internal stability of her own court, it was about the very survival of the kingdom. Against external threats, she was not just safeguarding the royal line, she was safeguarding the national borders. Carolingian Empire itself under Charlemagne was constantly expanding, often absorbing or dominating weaker neighbors. The very existence of such a powerful entity meant that smaller, less stable realms were under immense pressure to secure their own futures. Queen's inability to provide a son thus became a source of national anxiety, a fear that the kingdom they had built or inherited could be dismantled piece by opportunistic foreign powers. The court, the military leaders, and the king's advisors would certainly impress upon the queen the strategic importance of a male heir. They would explain, perhaps implicitly, that a strong, undisputed succession guaranteed military strength and diplomatic leverage. A king who could boast of a robust line of sons was a king to be respected and feared. A king without one was a tempting target. Consider the delicate dance of alliances and diplomacy. Marriages were often used to secure peace treaties or forge powerful alliances. If a queen failed to produce a male heir, it could undermine existing alliances, as other royal families might question the long-term viability of their partnership with a potentially unstable dynasty. They might seek new alliances or even turn against the kingdom, fearing that their own interests would be compromised by its internal turmoil. This added another layer to the queen's burden. She was not just responsible for dynastic survival, she was responsible for maintaining the kingdom's place on the international stage, for ensuring its continued independence and security. The medieval world was a harsh place, where power vacuums were rarely left unfilled. The absence of a male heir created precisely such a vacuum, a dangerous invitation to conquest that no queen nor her king could afford to ignore. Their very survival, and the survival of their people, rested on her ability to birth a son, the ultimate bulwark against foreign aggression. In this era, inheritance was overwhelmingly patriarchal. Land, titles, and power typically passed from father to son. For a queen, this meant that the very framework of society, the unwritten and often fiercely enforced rules of succession, placed immense pressure on her to produce a male heir. Kingdom was not merely a collection of lands, it was a vast patrimony, a family inheritance passed down through generations. Pass it to a daughter or to a distant male relative, because there was no direct son, was considered a significant breach of custom, often leading to challenges and conflict. In the Carolingian Empire, the concept of primogeniture, inheritance by the firstborn son, was becoming increasingly important, even if not universally applied without exception. Charlemagne himself, for example, had divided his empire amongst his sons, though only one Louis the Pious survived him. This custom reinforced the idea that male lineage was paramount. If a queen only bore daughters, these daughters, while valuable for marriage alliances, could not inherit the crown directly in their own right. They could not lead armies, govern vast territories in the same way, or carry on the family name and legacy in a male-dominated world. A daughter inheriting the throne would be an anomaly, almost certainly leading to claims from male relatives who believed they had a stronger, more traditional right to rule. Such a scenario was a recipe for civil war and instability. The Queen understood that her daughters, no matter how beloved, were not the solution to the succession question. Her daughters would be married off often to foreign rulers or powerful nobles, thus potentially diluting the royal bloodline's claim to the throne, or even transferring parts of the kingdom's influence to an external power. A son, however, would keep the crown, the lands, and the power firmly within the reigning dynasty. This inherent bias in the legal and customary framework of the time meant that a queen's reproductive capacity was directly tied to the fundamental rules of inheritance. Her womb was effectively the gatekeeper of the kingdom's future. Her failure to produce a male heir meant that the established order of inheritance would be thrown into disarray, leading to potentially devastating consequences for the realm. Even if a daughter could theoretically inherit, the practicalities were daunting. She would need a strong husband to rule on her behalf, and that husband might come from a rival family or even a foreign land, effectively subjugating the kingdom to external influence. This was an undesirable outcome for the powerful nobility and the king alike. Therefore, the customs and nascent laws of inheritance created a relentless pressure on the queen to produce a son. She was expected to conform to the established patriarchal order to ensure the smooth, customary transfer of power. Scholars like Professor Janet L. Nelson, who has extensively studied Charlemagne's family and succession, often highlight the importance of male heirs in Carolingian succession practices, even amidst evolving ideas of emperorship. Queen's body became the battleground for the preservation of these deeply ingrained inheritance patterns. Every failed pregnancy, every daughter born, was a direct challenge to the very foundation of how power was passed down, adding immense weight to her imperial duty. Number 5. Patriarchal society. Beyond specific laws or religious doctrines, the overarching structure of society in 790 AD was profoundly patriarchal. This deeply ingrained cultural framework meant that men held virtually all positions of power, authority, and public influence, while women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere and, crucially for a queen, procreation. This societal norm was not questioned. It was simply the way the world was understood to operate. For a queen, this meant that her value, both personally and politically, was overwhelmingly defined by her ability to produce a male heir. Her individual talents, her intelligence, her diplomatic skills, or her capacity for governance while potentially present, were secondary to this singular vital duty. In a patriarchal society, the family name, the lineage, and the inheritance all followed the male line. A woman was often seen as merely a vessel for carrying on her husband's name and bloodline. Her own family, though important for her marriage alliance, would eventually see her as belonging to her husband's house. This meant that, for the queen, the pressure to produce a son was a constant, pervasive force, shaping her identity from the moment she became a queen. She was not just a woman, she was the royal womb, the guarantor of the dynasty's continuity within a society that valued male leadership above all else. The very language and cultural expectations reinforced this. Phrases, proverbs, and everyday interactions would subtly or overtly emphasize the importance of sons for family legacy and societal strength. This patriarchal framework meant that even if a queen was a brilliant diplomat or a shrewd politician, her lack of a male heir would always overshadow these other accomplishments. She would be seen as failing in her most fundamental role, a role deemed essential by the society she inhabited. Her contributions in other areas would be diminished or perhaps even entirely disregarded if she could not provide a male successor. The historical record, through chronicles and letters of the time, consistently portrays queens primarily in their roles as mothers and wives, with emphasis placed on their fertility and the children they bore. This societal expectation was not unique to the Carolingian Empire. It was a pervasive characteristic of most early medieval European societies. Furthermore, a queen who only produced daughters might face direct and often harsh criticism from male members of the court, from the clergy, and even from the general populace. They might view her as an anomaly, as a deviation from the natural order. This societal judgment was a constant, invisible burden. Her perceived worth as a woman and as a queen was under constant scrutiny, judged by a singular criterion that was largely beyond her control. Her daily life, her interactions, her emotional state would all be colored by this overwhelming societal expectation. She was a woman in a man's world, and her greatest contribution, in the eyes of that world, was to provide another man to lead it. This deeply embedded patriarchal structure meant that the pressure to produce a male heir was not just a specific demand. It was the very air she breathed, the fundamental condition of her existence as a queen. Number 4. Religious doctrine in 790. Christianity, specifically its Roman Catholic form, was the dominant religion across Western Europe, and its doctrines and interpretation probably influenced every aspect of life, including royal succession. While there wasn't a direct biblical passage stating a queen must only produce male heirs, the broader teachings of the Church, combined with pervasive societal interpretations, heavily favored male leadership and placed immense pressure on queens to bear sons. The Church's emphasis on the male priesthood, the patriarchal structure of the Old Testament, and the Apostle Paul's epistles, for example, "Wives, be subject to your husbands in everything," all contributed to a theological environment where male authority was seen as divinely ordained. King was often seen as God's anointed, a direct representative of divine authority on earth. It was only natural, then, that his successor should also be a man capable of embodying this divine masculine power. Queen's role, while esteemed, was often framed within the context of Christian virtues: piety, humility, and motherhood. Her most blessed contribution in the eyes of the Church was to be a fruitful vine bearing children, especially sons who would continue the Christian line of kings. A queen who struggled to conceive a son might face not just worldly disappointment but also spiritual anxiety. Was her marriage unblessed? Had she committed some sin that God was punishing? The Church, often intertwined with royal power, would encourage the king to ensure a stable succession which almost universally meant a male one. Clerics, often advisors to the king, would interpret biblical passages or even historical precedents, like the struggles of ancient Israelite kings to secure their lines. To reinforce the necessity of a son, they might advise prayers, pilgrimages, and acts of charity specifically aimed at securing a male heir, implicitly adding to the queen's burden. Furthermore, the concept of a dynasty deeply rooted in the Old Testament narratives of kings like David was highly revered. The continuation of a divinely favored lineage was paramount, and this lineage was always understood to pass through the male line. If a queen failed to produce a son, it could even be interpreted by some fervent believers as a sign that God was withdrawing his favor from the dynasty, a truly terrifying thought for a medieval monarch and his subjects. This religious pressure was often internalized by the queen herself. As a devout Christian, she would genuinely believe in divine providence and would feel the weight of her spiritual duty to God and her kingdom. Her inability to conceive a son would not just be a personal sorrow, but a spiritual failure, a test of her faith, or even a divine judgment. The Church's teaching on the sacrament of marriage, while emphasizing procreation, did not explicitly mandate male offspring. However, the societal context, deeply influenced by these patriarchal religious interpretations, shaped the reality for queens. For example, if a king was considering an annulment due to a lack of a male heir, he would often seek the Church's approval, citing reasons that, while perhaps legally convoluted, ultimately stemmed from the desperate need for a son to maintain stability. The Church's willingness to grant such annulments, or pressure for them, effectively reinforced the notion that a queen's primary purpose was to provide a male heir. Scholars who analyze the role of the Church in medieval politics, such as Dr. Thomas F. X. Noble in his studies of the Carolingian period, often demonstrate how deeply intertwined religious belief and secular power were making the Church a significant voice in the pressure for dynastic continuity. Queen, therefore, was not only facing political and social pressure, she was facing a profound spiritual expectation, a divine imperative to ensure the survival of the royal lineage through a male child. Number 3. Military leadership. In 790, a king was not merely a ceremonial figurehead. He was, first and foremost, a warrior and a military leader. The very survival and expansion of a kingdom depended heavily on its monarch's ability to command armies, to lead men into battle, and to defend the realm against internal and external threats. This fundamental aspect of kingship placed an overwhelming pressure on a queen to produce a male heir, as only a son could realistically inherit and fulfill this vital military role. A queen, by virtue of her gender, was almost universally excluded from direct military command. Society did not envision women leading troops, riding into battle, or strategizing campaigns. While a queen might be a shrewd regent or a clever diplomat, she could not be the supreme military commander in the field, a role that was inextricably linked to royal authority. This meant that if a king died without a male heir, and a queen or a female regent was left in charge, the kingdom would immediately be seen as vulnerable and potentially weak in its military leadership. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne was a sprawling, expansionist power, constantly engaged in military campaigns against the Saxons, Avars, and other peoples on its borders. Charlemagne himself was a formidable military commander, and his sons were trained from a young age in warfare and statecraft. The expectation was that his successor would be equally capable in this critical arena. The entire court, the nobility, and the common soldiers all looked to the king for military guidance and protection. Queen's inability to produce a male successor therefore created a terrifying vacuum in this essential aspect of governance. Who would lead the armies if the king died? Who would inspire the troops, command the loyalty of battle-hardened veterans, and confront enemies on the battlefield? The very thought of a woman, no matter how capable in other respects, attempting to fill this role was anathema to the prevailing societal norms. This created immense anxiety among the powerful military magnates and the warrior class. Their loyalty, their land, and their very lives were tied to the strength of the monarchy and its military prowess. A strong male heir meant continuity of military leadership, predictable campaigns, and the assurance of strong defense. Without one, they faced the terrifying prospect of a weakened realm, perhaps even civil war, as various strongmen jostled for control, leading to internal strife and vulnerability to external enemies. The queen would feel this pressure acutely. She would know that her failure to provide a male heir directly undermined the military security of the kingdom. Her body was not just carrying a potential ruler. It was carrying the future military might and defensive capacity of the entire realm. The king himself, intensely aware of his military responsibilities, would impress upon the queen the vital importance of a son. He would train his sons from childhood in the arts of war, personally overseeing their military education. The absence of a son to train would be a profound personal disappointment for the king, and a strategic catastrophe for the kingdom. He would be desperate for a male heir to whom he could pass on his military legacy, someone who could continue his conquests and defend his hard-won territories. The chroniclers of the era are replete with accounts of kings leading their armies, highlighting this as a core aspect of their rule. To be a king was to be a warrior. The queen, through her womb, was expected to provide the next warrior king, thereby ensuring the military strength and continued security of the realm. Her inability to do so was not just a personal matter. It was a matter of national defense, a direct threat to the kingdom's ability to defend itself in a dangerous and unforgiving world. Number 2. Political stability of all the pressures, weighing on a queen to produce a male heir in 790. At the most profound and encompassing was the absolute imperative of political stability. Clear, undisputed male heir was the linchpin of an entire kingdom's political structure. Without one, the realm was a ticking time bomb, constantly on the verge of fracturing into civil war, succession crises, and widespread chaos. Continuation of the ruling dynasty through a direct male line was seen as the single most important factor in maintaining order, enforcing laws, and preventing the violent struggles for power that had plagued kingdoms throughout history. Imagine a kingdom where the king dies suddenly, and there is no obvious male successor. Immediately, ambitious cousins, powerful noble families, or even distant relatives would begin to press their own claims to the throne. Each claimant would rally their supporters, raise armies, and plunge the kingdom into internal conflict. This was not a hypothetical fear. The early medieval period was rife with such examples of kingdoms tearing themselves apart due to disputed successions. For the queen, therefore, the pressure to produce a son was fundamentally about preventing this terrifying scenario. Her womb held the key to peace or war for the entire realm. If she bore a son, the future of the crown was clear. The king's legitimate heir would ascend the throne, backed by the support of the established nobility, the church, and the populace who craved stability. This clarity allowed for long-term governance, the smooth administration of justice, and the predictable collection of taxes, all of which contributed to a functioning and prosperous society. Without a son, every decision, every diplomatic effort, every military campaign undertaken by the king would be overshadowed by the specter of what would happen after his death. The queen would feel this weight from every corner of the court. King's advisors, his powerful nobles, and even the common people would look to her as the guarantor of a peaceful transition of power. The very concept of the king's authority was strengthened by the existence of a clear heir. A monarch could rule with greater confidence, knowing that his legacy and his policies would be continued by his legitimate son. This allowed for strategic planning, for the establishment of lasting institutions, and for the overall consolidation of royal power. Conversely, a king without a male heir might find his authority subtly undermined as various factions within the court began to position themselves for the inevitable struggle for power that would ensue upon his death. Queen's failure to provide a male heir was therefore not just a personal disappointment. It was a profound threat to the very fabric of the kingdom's governance. It risked dissolving the bonds of loyalty, unleashing latent rivalries, and ultimately leading to the dismemberment of the realm. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne was, in a period of consolidation, where strong centralized authority was paramount. The succession was always a critical concern. Charlemagne, despite having multiple sons, still experienced the anxieties of succession and the need to designate an heir from among them. Queen's fundamental contribution to this political project was to ensure the legitimacy and directness of the succession. Historians who study medieval political theory, such as Dr. Susan Reynolds, frequently discuss how the concept of hereditary kingship was evolving and solidifying, with a clear male line being central to the idea of a stable, legitimate state. Queen's body was literally the vessel through which this essential political stability was maintained. Her failure to produce a son would not just disrupt the king's personal life, it would jeopardize the very foundations of the kingdom itself, risking anarchy and the complete collapse of central authority. This made the pressure on her an existential one, not just for herself, but for every single person living within the kingdom's borders. Number 1. Dynastic survival at the absolute pinnacle of all pressures, bearing down on a queen in 790 AD, towering above all others, was the primal existential imperative of dynastic survival. More than politics, more than economics, more than personal ambition, the very continuation of the ruling family's name, its bloodline, and its hold on power was the bedrock of royal existence. For a king, his queen's ability to produce a male heir was not merely desirable. It was the sole guarantee that his entire legacy, his conquests, his reign, and his family's future would not simply vanish with his death. Imagine the utter terror of a king, a monarch at the height of his power, contemplating the end of his line, the extinction of his family's name, and the crumbling of everything he had built. This was the silent, terrifying pressure that a queen carried every single day. A dynasty was not just a ruling family, it was the embodiment of the kingdom itself. It was the source of legitimacy, the fount of authority, and the historical link to the past that justified its present power. Without a male heir, the dynasty faced extinction. This meant that the king's ancestors, his father, grandfather, and all who came before him would have their efforts and their names rendered meaningless. His own bloodline, his very existence, would be a dead end. This was a profound personal and ancestral shame, a failure of the highest order. The queen, as the designated bearer of the next generation, was the singular vessel through which this horrifying outcome could be averted. Her fertility was the lifeline of the entire lineage. The pressure to produce a male heir for dynastic survival was so intense because the alternative was unthinkable. If the king died without a direct male heir, the kingdom would almost certainly descend into a bitter succession struggle. Various branches of the royal family, ambitious noble houses, or even foreign powers would put forward their claims, leading to devastating civil wars. Lands would be ravaged, populations decimated, and the very concept of a unified kingdom could shatter. Queen, therefore, was not just producing a child, she was producing the future of an entire family, a future that stretched back generations and projected forward into an uncertain tomorrow. She was the linchpin, the crucial link in an unbroken chain of kings. Her failure to provide a son meant that the chain would snap, with unimaginable consequences. This pressure was not just felt by the king and queen. It permeated the entire society. Powerful magnates and the church had a vested interest in the continuation of the current dynasty, as it provided stability and predictability for their own positions and wealth. They would exert immense pressure on the queen, through prayers, through subtle suggestions, and through desperate appeals to ensure the birth of a male heir. They saw her as the custodian of their collective future, her womb the crucible of their security. Historical accounts from this era, particularly those detailing the lives of powerful figures like Charlemagne, frequently underscore the importance of multiple male heirs to ensure dynastic continuity and provide a buffer against disease or early death. She was the mother of the future, the hope of the dynasty, the living embodiment of its continuity. Every pregnancy, every birth, was a moment of immense, almost unbearable anticipation. A daughter, while loved, was not the answer. Only a son could fulfill the sacred, all-consuming duty of dynastic survival. Her life, her purpose, her entire being revolved around this one, defining expectation. Her failure to deliver a male heir meant not just personal disappointment, but the potential end of a family, a name, and an entire kingdom. This was the ultimate inescapable pressure on queens in 790, a burden so profound that it shaped every moment of their royal lives.